Are you seeking fulfillment for your life? Do you want freedom from fear? That's why we're here. Welcome to Jesus 101, introducing you to the real Jesus. And now, here's your host, Elizabeth Talbot.
Welcome to Jesus 101. One more time, we continue with our series on the story of David, on his life. We have entitled this series, After God's Heart. And today, you might notice that I'm holding feathers here. I'm going to start with a story that has to do with the topic that we will discuss. What is forgiveness? And what does it mean? And how did David learn forgiveness in the many different levels that forgiveness has? Now, I have a story to tell you regarding a bird. When I was going through the biggest betrayal I went through in my life, when my best friend betrayed me in a big way, and I'm not going to tell you that part of this story, I had a hard time believing that this could have happened. And so somebody sent me a cassette tape. This is many years ago when we didn't have iPods and iPhones and all of that. And the cassette tape was on forgiveness, how to forgive. And the cassette tape started with this story of a dog and a bird and their master. You know, there was this man who owned a dog and a bird. So the three of them were very happy together and all this kind of stuff. And one day, the dog ate the bird. And the guy came in, the man that owned them, came in the house and saw these feathers coming out of the dog's mouth. And so he realized the dog had eaten the bird. From that day on, he made a little bundle with all the feathers that were left in the dog's mouth, put a little thing together. And every time the dog would come by, he took those feathers and rubbed them on the dog's nose, just to remind him that he remembered that he had killed the bird. So the dog didn't want to come around anymore. It went a long time, and he didn't want to come to his master anymore like he used to, because he knew that every time he came here, the master would take the feathers, rub the nose, and remind him of what he had done. The man started wondering why the dog wasn't coming around anymore. And one day he realized it was because of his constant reminder of what he had done. So there's a lot of questions in it. Obviously, that was in a difficult time for my life. And I question, what is forgiveness? Does forgiveness mean condoning? Or does forgiveness mean I'm staying around no matter what? Does forgiveness mean no boundaries? What does forgiveness really mean? And so we're going to discuss that, because David was a man after God's own heart, and he had to forgive in many different levels, even forgive himself. So today we're going to discuss one of those dark chapters in the family history of David and what we can learn about forgiveness. And I'm glad you join us for our feather program, because I think this is something that we all struggle with. And I'm so thankful that Pastor Mike Tucker is here with us. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You know, I don't know if most people know that you have been a counselor for a long time, and I'm sure that you have dealt with a lot of cases in which forgiveness was needed. At the same time, boundaries were needed.
Yeah, to forgive does not always mean reconciliation. It means that you can forgive and not hold something against someone, but if they're not safe for relationship, a boundary can be there. In fact, every healthy relationship has some sort of boundary, regardless. Boundaries are a necessary part. So it's a complicated mix, but it's something that we have to navigate in order to have healthy relationships.
Yes, and in our previous program, we talked about the great sin of David, the one exception to when he was no longer under God's, after God's own heart in that one event. He had to forgive himself, and then he had people that he had to forgive. You know, there is a parable in the New Testament in Luke chapter 7, verses 40 to 50, that talks about two people that owe, right? One that owes less, and one that owes a lot. And Jesus said to a man, who, both debts were forgiven. Who will love the master more?
Right.
And who is it?
And he said the one who had the greater debt. The greater debt was forgiven.
So he who thinks he's being forgiven little,
Yeah. Loves little.
loves little. But he who knows they've been forgiven much,
Loves greatly.
loves greatly. And David became a man who knew how to love greatly.
Yes.
He loved his sons, even though his sons rebelled against him. He knew what a great debt he had been forgiven by God. And so he learned to love greatly. And I think David never forgot the debt he had with God. So
When you acknowledge that, it does change how you treat other people. If you somehow think that your sin you've been able to hide it, or if you somehow think that, well, I got by, but I didn't really get forgiven, but I'm trying to earn my way,
yes.
then you treat sinners very differently than you do if you really realize, I've been forgiven such a huge debt. All God wants me to do is to pass this along to others.
Yeah.
Then it changes how you treat people.
You know, this is so important because when you go through an experience and you don't have yourself in like, well, okay, look, I'm perfect. Everything is great with me.
Yeah.
You're more compassionate towards others.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it happened to me lately that when I lost both of my parents, that when people post on Facebook that they just lost their parent, I used to be able to rush through things because there's thousands of things that come in, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, I would say a prayer for them and go on. Now it's like I have the need to stop and send them something and say, look, I've been through this. I know how you're feeling. And somehow you become more compassionate, you know, the more things you've been through.
I think that's true. If you go through a financial hardship, all of a sudden you have empathy for those who have financial difficulty.
Yeah.
If you've lost a child, you have genuine empathy for those who have lost a child, a spouse, a parent. It does begin to awaken in you those feelings of sorrow and empathy for people who are going through like situations.
So we're going to talk a little bit about David and forgiveness, and then we're going to talk about Absalom, the one son that rebelled against David. And once again, I want to tell you that I have read several books on David, but the one that has changed my life is called A Tale of Three Kings. And it's called A Tale of Three Kings because of these three kings, Saul, David, and Absalom, who wanted to be king. Yeah. So don't forget that Saul had the power when David was young. But then David had the power when Absalom was young.
Right.
And David treated Absalom very different than Saul treated David.
That's right.
And as I said in a previous program, one of the best lines in the whole book is God used Saul to kill the soul in David.
Right.
So that when David would be king, he wouldn't be a king in the order of Saul.
Right.
Right? So hopefully all of us know that we have been forgiven much.
That is the truth. And when you realize that, then it does change everything. When you are in danger is when you think you no longer have anything for which to be forgiven.
Yes.
I heard of a pastor who announced to his congregation that he was now officially without sin. Yeah, I know. It is almost laughable, and yet
no, it is laughable. Not almost.
The man was convinced, and when I was told of this, I said, "That is a man who's in peril of his soul."
Yeah.
Because when you come close to Jesus, the very first thing you see is your need of Him. You see your own sinfulness and your need of forgiveness, your need of a Savior. And when you no longer see your need of a Savior, then you are far removed from Jesus.
Yeah, and I always tell people, if you see somebody walking around with a Bible under their arm and saying, hey, I'm so holy, look at me.
Look at me.
I said, that person is very far away from God, because one of the things we do know is that the closer you get to God, the more sinful you will feel.
Absolutely.
So you have that paradox
That's
constantly.
True. That's true.
So let's talk a little bit about David. You know, he had to forgive in so many levels. You know, I have three hearts here. He had to forgive those who were above him. Let's see if I this right.
Good.
Because Saul
was over
him, right? And Saul was the king. He had to forgive the king, the institution of the king.
Right.
God had put that king there.
Right.
I mean, I know people that are watching this program who have been hurt by something that was above them, whether it was the church or a school or people that were
an
employer who people that were had an umbrella over them.
Yeah, a parent.
A parent.
Yeah.
Right?
So, yeah.
Yeah. So he had to forgive at that level. Then he had to forgive himself, which is probably one of the hardest things to do, is when you have to forgive yourself. Because sometimes we have confessed the sin and we are the ones constantly bringing it up, right? I mean...
Yeah, and I've seen marriages thwarted because of this, where a sin was committed, the offended spouse forgives the offender, but the offender is never able to forgive themselves, thus shutting themselves off from receiving the love and the forgiveness that their spouse wanted to give them. And I've seen marriages end, not because of an unforgiving spouse, but because of this individual who could not forgive themselves for what they did in the first place.
Wow.
Yeah.
And the third level that David had to forgive was those who were under him.
Right.
In this case, that we're going to see today, his son, who will rebel against him. And as a matter of fact, he will have another son who will rebel against him. And then he will have a son who will commit a great crime in the family. So there's a lot of things in what is forgiveness, what is not forgiveness. So one of the first things we want to define is what forgiveness is not.
Right.
So what can we say that forgiveness is not? Because there's great misunderstanding on this.
Forgiveness is not saying that it didn't hurt or it didn't matter or that it wasn't really a crime. So it's not forgiveness for me to say, oh, it didn't matter, don't worry about it, you didn't hurt me. Well, you did hurt me. And so that's not what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is not saying what you did was justified.
Exactly.
It doesn't say that at all.
Okay, so forgiveness is not denial.
Not denial, not justification.
Not justification.
Yeah.
It's not condoning, saying, okay, this is okay.
Yeah.
It's not okay.
Doesn't condone it, no.
Okay. And forgiveness is also not no boundaries.
No boundaries. In other words, it means that forgiveness is not always reconciliation. Sometimes a boundary has to be placed, and that boundary may be no reconciliation. I forgive you, but we're going to, because you're not safe for a relationship, we live apart now. And other times the boundary just simply says, I forgive you, but let's make sure this doesn't happen again. Is there a boundary we can establish in order to help protect us from this happening again?
You know, I just came back from heading a women's retreat. There were 608 women in one hotel. It was a crazy weekend, as you can imagine. 600 women in one big ballroom. And, you know, they put hours for people to counsel, and constantly in these big audiences, you'll find women that say, look, my husband is constantly unfaithful. He says to me that he's unfaithful, but people are telling me I have to forgive him. So what would you say to somebody like that?
Forgive him, but you may divorce him. I think that to forgive and put a boundary there is going to be the appropriate thing. And that boundary may be that you leave him. Because Jesus said that one of the conditions for divorce and remarriage would be unfaithfulness. And I think that is particularly true with serial adultery.
Exactly.
And so you may forgive, all right, I'm not going to hold this against you, but I'm also not going to trust you because you've demonstrated to me what you're going to do every time. So you've told me that you do not value the relationship, and because of that, you've ended the relationship. So I'm going to formalize it through a divorce. But I'm not going to
hold resentment against you because I wouldn't be able, I will hold myself hostage.
I destroy myself if I hold resentment against you. I punish me for your sin. Why would I do that?
Yeah, and I have once, when I had to go through a lot of help on this area, just trying to hold this grudge or having resentment is like taking poison, hoping that your enemy will die.
That's right, and that's what happens.
That's what it is. Okay, so we're going to go through something that happens in the life of David and in the life of his family in 2 Samuel chapter 13. In 2 Samuel chapter 13, we have a great crime that will be committed against one of the daughters of David, and unfortunately, he doesn't do much about it.
No, David really, he fails here. He fails as a father and as a protector.
Yeah, so in 2 Samuel chapter 13, see, he had many sons and daughters from different wives. So even though
which is also a problem.
Big problem, right? Because polygamy is not God's will.
Yeah.
Anytime you have a question about what the ethical what is the word of God is, like what's the goal of something, go to Genesis 1 or 2. You will find the whole thing there. From diet to marriage to monogamy to the way to treat the earth and the way to treat the animals and
each other. That's right. All of it.
All of it. So there was this man, his firstborn, Amnon, who really was in lust, it wasn't in love, with one of the daughters from a different wife. Verse 11 and 12, we have one of the saddest stories in 2 Samuel 13, verse 11 and 12.
When she brought them in to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, "Come lie with me, my sister." But she answered him, "No, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing."
And so, unfortunately, this says, verse 14,
However, he would not listen to her since he was stronger than she. He violated her and lay with her.
What do we call that now?
Rape.
This is one of the cases in the Bible that we have direct and explicit rape.
Rape. There's no other word for it.
Yes, and after he was with him, he despised her, which is usually what happens.
Yeah, didn't want her anymore.
Yes, and she wasn't. She was told to keep silent. I don't know how many women are watching us today who were told, "Don't say anything because that was your uncle. They're gonna get upset.
Yeah.
The family, you're gonna
Yeah. That is always, basically, that victim has now been violated twice. First by the perpetrator, and secondly by the system or the family that has asked her to remain quiet. Because those are the individuals who should be standing up for her and protecting her and vindicating her. This was not about you. This was about the perpetrator. The perpetrator committed a crime and needs to be held accountable for that crime because you deserve better treatment. That is the proper response.
Yes.
And to
But this
fail
is not
to
what
give
happened
that
here.
violates the child a second time.
Twice. And so Absalom was actually her birth brother.
Yes.
She stayed with him. Look at verse 20 and verse 21 of the same chapter.
Then Absalom, her brother, said to her, "Has Amnon, your brother, been with you? But now keep silent, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this matter to heart." So Tamar remained and was desolate in her brother Absalom's house.
And look what the father did, King David.
Now, when King David heard of these matters, he was very angry.
He was very angry, and we expect the next verse to say, so he got a hold of Amnon, and he did nothing.
Nothing happened. Nothing
He
happened.
was a little angry.
Yeah, but he didn't do anything.
A lot of people say that he didn't do things because he felt so guilty about what he had done with Bathsheba.
It could be. It could be that he just had a habit of being a permissive father. Maybe he valued the boys more than he did the girls. There are all sorts of
Maybe
explanations.
he didn't want to make waves and the whole city that what happened.
Yeah, look at my family. It brings my family into shame.
Yes, but because he did not do that, things got a lot worse. Because if you don't face the things when you need to face them, I can guarantee you they will grow and get worse.
You will face it eventually, but it'll be on a much larger scale.
So here
Much
we
worse.
start what we call the reinforcing loop that Absalom will go through of his rebellion, but it doesn't start like a rebellious thing. It's a lot worse. Look at this. First of all, verse 23, Absalom waits for 2 years. You think revenge is not patient?
Yeah.
Very patient.
Very patient. So he waits for 2 years. It
verse
came
23.
After 2 years that Absalom had sheep's shears in Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim, and Absalom invited all the king's sons.
They said, all my half-brothers, come over here, let's have a lunch. And when they're in the middle of this, he says, I'm going to tell you what you have to do and kill Absalom. And in that dinner, 2 years after the rape, they killed
Absalom.
Absalom had ordered that Amnon would
be killed.
So 2 years, right?
Right.
Then after that, he fled because obviously he was afraid of what was going to happen. Because now David might have been ready to punish Absalom, but Amnon was dead.
Yeah.
So he hadn't done anything in the first place. Okay. So verse 37.
37 says, Now Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur, and David mourned for his son every day.
Now, you know who this guy was, Talmai?
No.
He was his grandfather.
Okay.
This was the father of the wife of David that was the mother of Absalom.
Okay.
Because don't forget that one of the ways that David made alliances was marrying everybody under mother, right? Yeah. So, not under mother, but everybody. So he had all these alliances, right? So he had all these sons. Yeah. And so the king of Geshur was the father of the wife of David. Okay. So this man had to flee somewhere, and he went to his grandfather's house. Yeah. And look how long he stayed there in verse 38.
38, so Absalom had fled and gone to Geshur and was there 3 years.
Okay, so we already had 2 years since the rape. Then he kills Amnon. Yeah. Then spends 3 more years with his grandfather. Yeah. So that's 5 years. And then they do a whole thing. I hope you read it because it's fascinating. So Absalom comes back to Jerusalem, but David won't see him. So he allows him to return, but he won't see him.
Won't talk to him.
And now this is chapter 14 of 2 Samuel, verse 20. 28. And we add more time now, verse 28.
Now Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem and did not see the king's face.
Okay, so 2 years
After
since
the
the
rape,
rape, and then killed Amnon.
3
years
years
with the grandfather. 2 years in Jerusalem.
7 years.
7 years
Yeah.
since the first
Yeah.
event, right? Now, think about it like this. This is a reinforcing loop. You know, the rape happens. Nobody's saying anything about it.
Right.
The sister's staying with him in his house. And he waits for 2 years. And then he kills Amnon. Then for 3 years, he's isolated. For 2 more years, he's an outcast. And when we are turning over here, by then he's ready to do something really big.
Really
See,
big.
One time I learned something. one time.
One time. Well, that's more than some people get, so go for it.
I thought you were going to say one time. That if you don't process feelings and events when you're supposed to, they will grow and eventually master you.
That's
So,
true.
so if I am sad and I said, you know, I'm sad and let's talk about what just happened. If you keep it and keep it and keep it and keep it, 7 years from now, you're going to do a crazy thing and you're not going to know where it came from.
An example of that is grief. The rule of thumb for grief is the sooner and more intensely you grieve, the sooner you get better. The longer you put it off and deny it, the worse it's going to hurt and the worse it will hurt you.
Wow.
And so if you try to deny this and not deal and process those feelings early on, it will catch up with you and it will destroy you.
Yeah, they grow and they become a monster.
They do.
Right?
Yeah.
And so this is what happened. What happened next is one of the saddest things we have in the history and the story of David. Chapter 18 tells us that he went on full rebellion.
Full-scale rebellion and almost taking the kingdom away from his dad.
Yes, and he wanted to take the kingdom away from his dad.
That's what he wanted to do.
And you can read all of this in 2 Samuel chapter 15 and chapter 16. Unfortunately, our time is going very, very fast. But there's a couple of things that I want to tell you. Let's look at verse 33. Because see, let me see if I can do this. Let me reverse this. David is having the opposite reinforcing loop. He has learned from his time from Saul that if you try to fight things, when people send spears to you, instead of sending spears back, that you can submit to God's will.
Yeah.
And so he's having a reinforcing loop but the other way. He's saying, well, if God wants to take the kingdom away from me, I'll leave.
Yeah, I'll let him have it.
If God wants to restore it from me,
I'll come back.
I'll come back. But please take care of Absalom, my son. Even though he's rebellious, I still love him.
Right.
And when Absalom will die, he says, oh, I wish I could have died in your place.
Yeah.
He's having the opposite because when he was young, God allowed Saul to kill the soul in David.
Right.
Isn't that amazing?
So his response in that opposite loop is a healthier response.
It's like,
now, he made his mistakes early on by not dealing with the sin early on.
Absolutely.
But in his response to this whole thing, he's dealing with it in a much more spiritual and much healthier way.
Yes. And one of the saddest verses for me is 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 33, when the king actually, I want to tell you guys a few things before. Do you mind if I go back a little bit?
It's your program. It's your program. I mean, you can do what you want to do.
And I cry if I want to?
Yes, it's your party. You can cry if you want to.
There's so much I want to show and so little time. Okay, so if we go back to 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 30, David is having to leave his city, the nevertheless city that he fought for. And 2 Samuel 15, verse 30. Let's go there.
Verse 30 says, and David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives and wept as he went, and his head was covered, and he walked barefoot. Then all the people who were with him, each covered his head and went up weeping as they went.
Imagine this for a moment.
Yeah.
And actually, we went there with our team. The Mount of Olives is not that far away from Mount Zion, per se, where Jerusalem was. But this was a low procession with a lot of people. And this is the king who's exiting his own city, the one that he has gotten with his own hands
he
from
took
the
the city,
Jebusites.
he built the city. Yeah.
Right?
Right.
He's going out, he's going to towards the Mount of Olives, which is across the valley on the other side. It's an incredible sight to see that. And David is weeping all the way over there, and the people are with him are weeping.
Yeah.
And one of the things that David learned is that his future was in God's hands. So instead of throwing spears, which he could have done, he had a whole army who fought for
Yeah,
him.
could have taken care of it.
Yeah, he decided, okay, I'm going to let God handle this one. What does it take to do that in a crisis?
It sure takes a lot of faith and a lot of confidence in your God.
Yeah.
It does.
Because he could have gotten matters in his own hands.
Oh, he could have. But it means subjugating your will to the will of the Father and trusting Him to be your defender, Him to be your king, Him to be the one who sees things through.
Wow. You know, Jesus did that in Garden of Gethsemane.
He did. He could have called 10,000 angels, as the song says.
Well, but what is so weird about it is the Mount of Olives and Gethsemane are in the same spot.
Right.
So when you're going to the Mount of Olives, prophetically, I think, Jesus would say the same words in the same place. We were standing in the Garden of Gethsemane, imagining Jesus saying, if there's any other way, but if not, your will be done.
Yeah, let this cup pass from me. But,
absolutely.
But,
and now I have to take you when Absalom is killed. And you know, remember he was hanging by his hair and all of that. In chapter 18 is a fascinating story. I hope you take the time to read it. When he was told that Absalom had died. Now this is the son that has rebelled against him.
Right. The one who tried to kill him, tried to take the kingdom, and would have killed him had he been successful.
Verse 33 of 2 Samuel chapter 18.
The king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And thus he said as he walked, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son."
This is the love of a father who is grieved, and he would have preferred to die in the place of his rebellious child.
Yeah.
You know, and so he had learned to love way above hate. He could have sent spears. He could have sent armies.
And probably would have been justified in doing so, many would say.
Yes.
But he was, despite his mistakes as a father, he had the heart of a father, and he loved his son.
Thanks for being here with us, Mike. Did you know that David is a symbol of Christ? And a lot of things that David went through, Jesus would go through in a much greater scale. God also had children who rebelled against him. And God had the power to just destroy us and say, no, the kingdom is mine. How dare you rebel against me? But he said, oh, my son, oh, my daughter, I love you so much. I wish I could die instead of you. And he did die instead of us. I have this porcelain since I'm 12 years old. It's 40 years old. It's the Lord's Prayer. And the Lord's Prayer reminds us, forgive others. Help us to forgive others the way you forgive us. Well, forgiveness means that I accept that I have been forgiven much, and therefore I'm going to forgive others. That doesn't mean you're going to stay, doesn't mean no boundaries. It means I'm not going to hold a grudge because I've been forgiven so much. I rebelled against my father. He forgave me and died in my place.